12th July, 1943, London. Inside a secure planning room at SHAEF, a thick folder was opened and marked Rankin, most secret. The paper stock was heavier than normal. The margins were wider. The maps inside were already outdated the moment they were printed. The folder contained 3 separate invasion scenarios, each written for a war outcome that officially did not exist. Germany had not surrendered. Berlin had not fallen. Hitler was still alive. Yet Allied planners were already preparing for a Europe without a functioning German state. And more importantly, a Europe that could be seized by whoever moved first. The documents carried no optimism, no victory language, only conditional sentences. If German resistance collapses suddenly, if the Nazi regime fragments internally, if local commanders surrender without authorization, each condition led to the same conclusion. Speed mattered more than battle. Whoever crossed the German frontier first would decide the political future of Europe. Operation Rankin was not a battlefield plan in the traditional sense. It was not about defeating German armies. It was about occupying space before the Red Army could reach it. That fact alone made Rankin different from every other Allied operation of the war. The folder contained 3 versions: Rankin A, Rankin B, and Rankin C. Together, they outlined a single forbidden assumption: that Nazi Germany might collapse from within, and that when it did, the war against Hitler would instantly become a race against Stalin. This assumption was never stated publicly. It never appeared in speeches. It was not shared with smaller Allied governments. It existed only inside classified memoranda circulated between London, Washington, and SHAEF headquarters. The planners knew something uncomfortable. The Soviet Union was advancing faster than anyone expected, and once the Red Army occupied territory, it did not leave. The Rankin files treated this as a logistical reality, not a diplomatic concern. Inside the folder were deployment tables, railway seizure priorities, and airborne landing zones deep inside Germany, areas no Allied soldier was officially supposed to reach until well into 1945. Some landing zones were marked less than 150 miles from Berlin. Others pointed directly at Austria, Czechoslovakia, and northern Italy. These were not theoretical exercises. Each scenario listed specific divisions, estimated days to contact, and minimum troop numbers required to assert control before Soviet arrival. The language was clinical. There was no mention of ideology, no reference to communism, only one recurring phrase: political vacuum. The planners feared that a sudden German collapse would create a vacuum large enough for the Red Army to pour through uncontested. Once that happened, negotiations would become meaningless. Borders would harden around tank tracks. This fear did not originate in Moscow. It originated in Allied intelligence reports. By mid-1943, intercepted communications and frontline assessments showed that German command cohesion was weakening unevenly. Some army groups were still intact. Others were held together by fear alone. Allied analysts began to consider a scenario where entire regions might surrender without orders, or simply stop fighting. If that happened, the traditional Allied invasion timetable would become irrelevant overnight. Rankin existed to answer one question only: what do we do if Germany falls faster than planned? The answer, written in dry operational language, was brutal. Land immediately. Occupy key cities. Seize ministries, radio stations, rail hubs. Declare military authority before anyone else does. There was no mention of liberation ceremonies, no coordination with resistance groups, no consultation with governments in exile. Rankin assumed chaos and intended to exploit it. The most sensitive pages dealt with Berlin, even though Allied leaders publicly insisted the city was not an objective. In Rankin, Berlin appeared repeatedly, not as a battle target, but as a political prize. Whoever entered Berlin first would control Germany's administrative corps. Yet Rankin was also deeply pessimistic. Several internal notes warned that even under optimal conditions, Allied forces might not reach central Germany before Soviet spearheads. Rail damage, fuel shortages, and overstretched supply lines made rapid eastward movement uncertain. One handwritten margin note captured the anxiety clearly: delay, decision. The folder was never meant to leave secure rooms. It carried no operational deadlines, no public references, no press strategy. Rankin was designed to be activated silently, or never at all. What made Rankin truly radioactive was not its military ambition, but its implication. The Allies were already planning for a post-Nazi confrontation before Nazi Germany had been defeated. That reality contradicted every public statement of unity, every photograph of smiling leaders, every declaration of shared purpose. Rankin acknowledged what diplomacy could not. The alliance was temporary, conditional, and already fracturing under the weight of geography. By late 1943, Rankin began circulating among a very small group of planners. It never received a ceremonial approval. No signatures from heads of state, only quiet annotations, revisions, and eventual stagnation. As the war progressed, something changed. The Red Army advanced faster than the worst projections. Allied planners realized that Rankin's timelines were becoming fantasy. Even if Germany collapsed suddenly, Soviet forces were already too close to the objectives Rankin sought to secure. Without ever being officially canceled, Rankin began to die. No announcement marked its end. No memo declared it obsolete. It simply stopped being discussed. After the war, Rankin vanished from public histories. It was absent from memoirs, missing from victory narratives, unmentioned in discussions of Allied strategy. Because acknowledging Rankin would require admitting something far more uncomfortable, that the fate of Europe was not decided at Yalta alone. It was constrained months earlier by a plan that recognized and failed to stop Soviet dominance. Operation Rankin was the moment the Allies quietly accepted that they might lose the peace even if they won the war. And they prepared for it anyway. Operation Rankin did not emerge from optimism. It emerged from fear. A very specific fear that Allied leaders could not express publicly without shattering the image of unity that held the coalition together. By early 1943, Allied intelligence assessments had begun to converge on a disturbing possibility. Nazi Germany might not fall the way everyone expected. Not through a clean, centralized surrender after total military collapse, but through fragmentation, sudden, uneven, region-by-region breakdown. This possibility terrified planners more than prolonged resistance. A slow German defeat allowed coordination, conferences, press statements, and agreed occupation zones. A sudden collapse created chaos, and chaos favored the side already closest to the ground. That side was the Red Army. The Soviet advance after Stalingrad fundamentally altered Allied calculations. German forces in the east were not merely retreating. In some sectors, they were disintegrating. Entire formations surrendered, dissolved, or retreated without coherent command. Intelligence summaries began using language that had not appeared before: structural failure, command paralysis, local collapse. These phrases triggered alarms in London and Washington. If German command broke unevenly, Allied invasion timetables would become irrelevant overnight. Plans like Overlord were built around resistance, not vacuum. They assumed the enemy would fight all the way to the Rhine and beyond. But what if he didn't? Rankin was born to answer that question. Inside SHAEF planning circles, analysts began modeling scenarios where Germany ceased to function as a centralized state, while large portions of its army still existed in pockets. In such a case, surrender would not arrive as a single event. It would arrive as a series of local decisions made by commanders trying to save themselves, their men, or their regions. Whoever responded fastest to those decisions would inherit control. This was not speculation. Allied intelligence had already seen versions of this phenomenon in Italy. When Mussolini fell in 1943, German forces reacted faster than the Allies. They seized infrastructure, disarmed Italian units, and turned a political collapse into a military advantage within days. Planners feared the reverse could happen in Germany, except this time the beneficiary would be the Soviet Union. Rankin was, at its core, a counter-collapse plan. It assumed that Allied leaders might wake up one morning to find that German resistance had evaporated in certain regions, not because of Allied pressure, but because of internal failure. If that happened, the decisive factor would not be firepower. It would be presence. Rankin therefore focused obsessively on geography, rail junctions, airfields, government ministries, broadcast stations, industrial regions. These were not tactical objectives. They were political anchors. Whoever controlled them would define authority before negotiations even began. The plan's existence also reflected growing distrust within the alliance itself. By mid-war, Allied leaders no longer viewed post-war cooperation as guaranteed. Diplomatic cables and internal memoranda reveal a growing awareness that the Soviet Union's objectives diverged sharply from those of Britain and the United States. Publicly, this divergence was downplayed. Privately, it was assumed. Rankin treated the Soviet advance as a strategic constraint, not a partner movement. That alone explains why the plan remained so tightly compartmentalized. It was never discussed in joint Allied councils that included smaller nations. It was never shared with governments in exile. Even within SHAF, access was limited. Rankin's planners understood that acknowledging the plan openly would provoke political backlash, especially from Eastern European allies who still believed liberation meant sovereignty. Rankin implied something else entirely. It implied that sovereignty would belong to whoever arrived first. Another reason Rankin existed was logistical reality. The Western Allies were constrained by oceans, ports, and supply chains stretching back to North America. Every mile eastward increased strain. The Red Army, by contrast, advanced on contiguous land, supported by massive manpower reserves and brutal tolerance for losses. Even Allied planners sympathetic to confrontation with Stalin recognized the limits of what could be achieved militarily. Rankin attempted to exploit windows, not campaigns, short moments where German collapse created openings before Soviet forces could fill them. That is why Rankin emphasized airborne units, rapid mechanized columns, and immediate assumption of military government authority. It was not designed to fight for territory. It was designed to claim it before a fight occurred. Yet the very need for such a plan exposed Allied weakness. Rankin existed because leaders knew they could not stop the Red Army head-on without triggering another war. There was no appetite for that. Casualty projections alone made it politically impossible. So planners searched for alternatives: speed, timing, collapse exploitation. Rankin was the last of those options. It also reflected a deeper psychological shift. By 1943, Allied leaders were no longer planning simply to defeat Germany. They were planning to manage the aftermath of victory. And they did not trust that aftermath to resolve itself peacefully. Rankin acknowledged that the war's final phase might not be a battle at all, but a scramble, one decided by rail timetables, landing orders, and pre-written proclamations of authority. In that sense, Rankin was not a betrayal of Allied ideals. It was an admission that ideals alone would not shape Europe. Power would. And Rankin existed because Allied planners feared that without it, all power would flow east by default. Operation Rankin was not a single plan. It was 3 separate responses to 3 different forms of German collapse, each reflecting a different level of chaos, resistance, and opportunity. The distinctions mattered because each scenario produced a radically different Europe. Inside the planning files at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Rankin was broken down with deliberate precision. No scenario assumed a clean surrender. No scenario assumed political cooperation. Each began from the same premise. Germany might stop functioning before it was defeated. Rankin A was the most optimistic and the least likely. It assumed a near-total internal collapse of the Nazi regime. Hitler removed or incapacitated. Central authority fractured. Large German formations either surrender outright or await instructions that never arrive. Under Rankin A, Allied forces would not fight their way into Germany. They would walk into it. The plan prioritized immediate airborne and mechanized insertion into key political and industrial centers, not front lines, cities, ministries, rail hubs, communication centers. The objective was to impose Allied military government authority before any alternative power structure could emerge. Rankin A's documents emphasized speed over strength. Light forces were considered acceptable because resistance was assumed to be minimal or disorganized. The goal was not to defeat German units. It was to arrive first and declare control. Berlin appeared prominently in Rankin A, not as a battlefield, but as an administrative vacuum waiting to be filled. Allied planners understood that whoever controlled Berlin would inherit Germany's legal and symbolic core. But Rankin A also contained a warning. If Soviet forces arrived simultaneously, confrontation was to be avoided. The plan explicitly discouraged armed clashes with Red Army units. Political disputes would be deferred to higher authority, meaning facts on the ground would already decide outcomes. Rankin A was fast, fragile, and entirely dependent on timing. If Germany collapsed completely and suddenly, it offered the Allies their only chance to shape Central Europe without fighting the Soviets directly. Rankin B was darker and more realistic. It assumed partial collapse. German central authority weakened, but regional commands remained intact. Some formations continued fighting. Others surrendered independently. Resistance existed, but unevenly. This scenario terrified planners because it created patchwork control. Under Rankin B, Allied forces would advance selectively, exploiting gaps rather than driving a continuous front. Certain cities might be entered peacefully. Others would require combat. The plan anticipated confusion, local negotiations, and contradictory surrender claims. Rankin B expanded the role of psychological operations and rapid liaison teams. Officers trained in civil affairs would move immediately behind advancing units, assuming control of police forces, utilities, and local administrations. Crucially, Rankin B treated Soviet forces not as enemies but as competitors. The files acknowledge that in a partial collapse, Red Army units might enter some regions uncontested while Allied forces occupied others. The resulting boundary lines would harden quickly. Rankin B therefore emphasized territorial denial rather than conquest. The objective was to block Soviet access to key areas, Bavaria, Austria, Western Czechoslovakia, not by force but by presence. The documents reveal acute anxiety about timing. A delay of days or even hours could determine whether an entire region fell under Western or Soviet influence. Rankin B also recognized Allied limitations. Supply lines would be strained. Communications would be chaotic. The risk of accidental clashes with Soviet troops was considered high. In that sense, Rankin B was not a plan for victory. It was a plan to limit loss. Rankin C was the most pessimistic and the most grounded in reality. It assumed no meaningful German collapse at all, only localized surrenders and gradual degradation. Central authority weakened but did not disintegrate. Resistance continued across much of Germany. Under Rankin C, the plan resembled a modified version of existing invasion strategy, with one crucial difference: it anticipated sudden opportunities and demanded immediate exploitation when they appeared. Rankin C did not promise dramatic territorial gains. It focused on opportunistic occupation. When German units surrendered in one area, Allied forces would move instantly to occupy and administer that territory, even if neighboring areas remained hostile. This required unprecedented flexibility. Commanders were authorized to deviate from pre-planned axes of advance if political objectives could be secured. Rankin C also contained the clearest recognition of Allied weakness. It acknowledged that the Red Army would likely occupy most of Central and Eastern Europe regardless of Allied intentions. The goal was no longer to block Soviet expansion entirely. It was to preserve bargaining leverage. Every city held west of a certain line mattered. Every ministry occupied could later be cited in negotiations. Rankin C treated post-war diplomacy as an extension of logistics. What united all three Rankin scenarios was their underlying assumption: the war's end would not be orderly. They rejected the idea of a single surrender document followed by neat transitions. Instead, they envisioned collapse, confusion, competing claims, and rapidly solidifying realities. Rankin was not written to win the war. It was written to survive its ending. Yet even as the scenarios were refined, their feasibility eroded. Soviet advances accelerated. German resistance in the East collapsed faster than even pessimistic projections. The windows Rankin depended on began to close before they ever opened. By late 1944, Rankin A was effectively impossible. Rankin B was shrinking by the week. Rankin C remained theoretically viable, but offered diminishing returns. The plan still existed on paper, but Europe was already being decided elsewhere. On paper, the race to Berlin looked possible. On the ground, it never was. By mid-1944, Allied planners had begun running hard distance and time calculations tied directly to Operation Rankin. These were not optimistic projections. They were brutally conservative estimates built around fuel availability, bridge capacity, rail repair times, and the simple physical limits of moving men and armor across a shattered continent. The results were sobering. From the Western Allied bridgeheads in France, Berlin lay over 600 miles away. That distance alone was not decisive. What mattered was what lay between: destroyed rail networks, demolished bridges, urban choke points, a retreating German army still capable of organized resistance. Every mile east increased friction. Rankin planners understood that even if German resistance collapsed suddenly in parts of the Reich, movement would not be instantaneous. Roads were cratered. Rail lines required engineers before trains could run. Fuel depots were limited and vulnerable. Every forward push depended on logistics catching up. By contrast, the Red Army was already deep inside Eastern Europe by the time Rankin was refined. Its supply lines, though crude, were shorter. Its tolerance for loss was far higher. And its operational doctrine emphasized relentless forward pressure over consolidation. This created an asymmetry no plan could erase. Rankin assumed that speed could compensate for distance. But speed itself depended on infrastructure, and infrastructure favored the side already closest. Allied planners mapped hypothetical advance rates under ideal conditions. Even the most aggressive estimates showed Western forces reaching central Germany weeks after Soviet spearheads under comparable collapse conditions. Those weeks were decisive. Berlin was not an isolated prize. It sat behind rivers, rail hubs, and population centers that would not simply open their gates. Even in collapse scenarios, German commanders were expected to defend symbolic ground longer than peripheral regions. The Red Army, advancing from the east, faced fewer such obstacles. Many German formations in its path were already degraded. Some had orders to delay, others had none at all. Rankin documents increasingly treated Berlin not as a target to be seized, but as a benchmark, a reference point used to measure how far behind the Allies were likely to be. The reality was stark. Even if Rankin were activated at the perfect moment, the probability of Western troops entering Berlin before Soviet forces was low. This recognition quietly reshaped the plan. Later revisions reduced emphasis on Berlin itself and increased focus on southern and western Germany, Austria, and northern Italy. These regions offered something Berlin no longer did: achievable leverage. Bavaria mattered because it anchored access to Austria. Austria mattered because it bordered the Balkans. Northern Italy mattered because it connected Western Europe to the Mediterranean sphere. Rankin's ambition narrowed as geography asserted itself. The race to Berlin also exposed a deeper constraint: political authorization. Even if Allied commanders believed a dash east was militarily possible, it required approval at the highest level. That approval never came. There was no appetite in Washington or London for a move that could trigger accidental clashes with Soviet forces. The risk of escalation, even unintended, was considered unacceptable while the war against Germany was still ongoing. Rankin planners were forced to work within a paradox. They were tasked with preparing for competition with the Soviets, while being explicitly forbidden from provoking it. This meant that even if Allied units reached contested areas, they were under orders to avoid confrontation. Presence mattered. Firepower did not. But presence without force had limits. Internal notes from late 1944 reflect growing pessimism. References to race gave way to arrival sequence. The language softened, expectations lowered. The planners were not naive. They could see the map changing week by week. Every Soviet advance erased another Rankin assumption. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, the Red Army was already nearing the Oder. The geographic math was no longer debatable. The race was over before it began. Rankin had not failed because it was poorly conceived. It failed because time itself became the enemy. The plan depended on a narrow window that never fully opened, and then slammed shut. What remained was a realization few leaders would acknowledge publicly. Europe was not going to be divided by negotiation alone. It was going to be divided by who stood where when the shooting stopped. Rankin had tried to influence that outcome. It could not overcome momentum. The plan still existed in files. It still circulated in reduced form, but its original purpose, blocking Soviet access to the heart of Germany, was no longer achievable. By early 1945, Rankin was less a blueprint than a relic, not because it was wrong, but because it had been overtaken by events moving faster than any staff room could plan. Operation Rankin did not die in a meeting. It died through silence, through decisions that were never formally announced, but were enforced with absolute discipline. At the center of that silence stood Dwight D. Eisenhower. By late 1944, Eisenhower was no longer just a battlefield commander. He was a political manager of coalition warfare. Every operational decision carried diplomatic weight, and every diplomatic signal carried operational consequences. Rankin placed him at the fault line between military possibility and political catastrophe. On paper, Rankin still existed. In practice, Eisenhower ensured it would never be activated in its original form. The core issue was not Berlin. It was authority. Eisenhower understood that any rapid eastward push under Rankin, even if framed as an emergency response to German collapse, would be interpreted by the Soviet Union as a deliberate attempt to alter agreed post-war arrangements. Whether that interpretation was fair did not matter. The reaction would define the next war, and Eisenhower was determined that there would not be a next war. Internal correspondence reveals a consistent pattern. Eisenhower repeatedly emphasized unity of command, clarity of objectives, and avoidance of unilateral actions. Rankin violated all three. Rankin required initiative at lower levels. It authorized deviation from established fronts. It empowered commanders to seize political assets on the fly. All of this ran counter to Eisenhower's insistence on centralized control. More importantly, Rankin assumed a degree of ambiguity that Eisenhower rejected. The plan lived in gray zones. Exploiting collapse without provoking confrontation. Eisenhower believed gray zones were where wars began by accident. He had seen this in North Africa, in Italy, in the chaos of coalition warfare where misaligned objectives produced unintended outcomes. Rankin magnified those risks exponentially. Another factor weighed heavily: casualty arithmetic. Even a limited confrontation with Soviet forces, accidental or otherwise, would require reinforcement, escalation, and justification to publics already exhausted by war. Eisenhower understood that Western societies had limits. Stalin's did not. Rankin offered no clean endpoint. If Allied forces raced east and encountered Soviet units occupying the same space, what then? Withdrawal would look like defeat. Resistance would look like war. Eisenhower chose neither. Instead, he locked Allied operations firmly into the Germany first, defeat first framework. Victory over the Wehrmacht would take precedence over every post-war maneuver. This decision effectively strangled Rankin. Orders emphasized strict adherence to agreed axes of advance. Boundaries were reinforced. Liaison mechanisms with Soviet commands were strengthened, not loosened. Any action that could be interpreted as a political grab was discouraged. Rankin's planners felt the shift immediately. References to Rankin's scenarios stopped appearing in operational briefings. Timelines were no longer updated. Scenario tables froze in place. The plan became archival rather than active. There was no memo declaring Rankin canceled. There did not need to be one. Eisenhower's authority was absolute within SHAF. What he did not discuss did not move. British officials, particularly those closer to Churchill, were deeply frustrated. They saw Rankin as the last remaining lever to prevent Soviet dominance in Central Europe. Eisenhower saw it as a lever that could snap the alliance in half. The disagreement was never resolved because it was never formally debated. Eisenhower insulated himself by framing every decision in military necessity. He spoke of logistics, supply, casualty ratios, and command coherence. He did not speak of ideology. This was deliberate. By grounding his choices in operational logic, Eisenhower removed them from political argument. Rankin was not rejected because it was immoral or aggressive. It was rejected because it was impractical under coalition conditions. Yet practicality had consequences. By refusing to exploit hypothetical collapse scenarios, Eisenhower ensured that Soviet advances would define occupation realities. The Red Army would arrive where it arrived, and negotiations would follow those facts. This was not ignorance, it was acceptance. Eisenhower believed that a stable peace required restraint during victory. He believed that pushing Rankin would poison post-war cooperation before it even began. Whether that belief was correct is still debated. What matters is that it guided action. By January 1945, Rankin existed only as a reference point, a reminder of paths not taken. Allied forces advanced deliberately, methodically, and predictably. The Red Army advanced relentlessly. When the meeting at the Elbe finally occurred, it was not the product of racing plans. It was the result of converging inevitabilities. Rankin had imagined speed as salvation. Eisenhower chose control instead. And in doing so, he closed the final window through which the Western Allies might have altered the political geography of post-war Europe. Operation Rankin did not disappear quietly in London. While it faded inside SHAF under Eisenhower's authority, it provoked deep and lasting anger within the British leadership, particularly among those who believed the war was already sliding toward a disastrous political conclusion. The divide was not abstract, it was personal. On one side stood British officials who had watched Europe fall twice in a generation. On the other stood American commanders who believed restraint was the only way to preserve the alliance long enough to win the war. At the center of British frustration was Winston Churchill. Churchill understood something Eisenhower did not have to confront in the same way. Britain's post-war survival depended on balance, not sheer power. The United States could afford a divided Europe. Britain could not. British memoranda from late 1944 reveal increasing alarm over Soviet intentions. They speak bluntly of irreversible occupation, political absorption, and permanent realignment. These were not ideological complaints. They were strategic warnings. Rankin, in British eyes, was the last remaining mechanism to prevent those warnings from becoming reality. Churchill and his advisors believed that if the Western Allies did not physically occupy as much territory as possible before Germany collapsed, diplomacy would become theater. Borders would follow tank tracks, not treaties. American leaders acknowledged this risk, but judged it less dangerous than provoking confrontation with the Soviet Union during active hostilities. The disagreement hardened into two incompatible philosophies. British thinking was shaped by imperial decline and historical memory. Britain had seen what happened when power vacuums were left unmanaged. It feared being sidelined in a continent increasingly dominated by two superpowers. American thinking was shaped by scale and optimism. The United States believed it could negotiate from strength after victory. It assumed that goodwill, institutions, and shared wartime sacrifice could moderate Soviet behavior. Rankin exposed the fault line. British officials pushed for flexibility, rapid exploitation, and political boldness. They wanted commanders empowered to seize opportunities even at diplomatic risk. American leadership insisted on discipline, predictability, and unity. They viewed unilateral actions as destabilizing and potentially catastrophic. This was not a theoretical debate. It affected operational orders. Requests for greater latitude in movement were denied. Proposals for accelerated advances into contested regions were shelved. British frustration grew as Soviet forces continued to surge westward. Churchill did not hide his anger privately. He warned repeatedly that Europe was being handed over by default. He urged reconsideration. He appealed to shared values. None of it altered Eisenhower's posture. What made the conflict especially bitter was that both sides knew time was running out. Each Soviet advance rendered Rankin less relevant. Each Allied pause confirmed British fears. The Americans were not blind to the consequences. They simply prioritized different risks. To Eisenhower and his Washington backers, the greatest danger was fracturing the alliance before Germany was defeated. To Churchill, the greatest danger was winning the war and losing Europe. Rankin became the symbol of that clash. As the plan faded, British officials began contemplating alternatives. Some would later evolve into far more aggressive post-war concepts. But during the war itself, they had no leverage left. They lacked manpower. They lacked independent operational control, and they lacked American support. By early 1945, British anger turned to resignation. Rankin was no longer discussed as a live option. It became a missed opportunity, one that British leaders believed history would judge harshly. The alliance held. The war was won. But the unity celebrated in public masked a deep sense of loss. Rankin had offered Britain a way to influence Europe's future beyond speeches and conferences. Its burial left Britain watching events unfold rather than shaping them. This tension did not vanish with victory. It carried forward into post-war planning, early Cold War strategy, and Britain's declining role in continental affairs. Rankin had failed not only as a plan, but as a test of Allied cohesion. Operation Rankin was designed to be invisible. It failed at that task long before it failed on the ground. The Soviet Union did not need a copy of the Rankin folder to understand its intent. By 1943, NKVD had built one of the most effective intelligence penetrations in modern history, not only inside Axis territory, but within Allied political and military environments themselves. Soviet intelligence did not learn about Rankin through a single dramatic leak. It learned through accumulation, fragments, patterns, absences, shifts in tone. The NKVD's strength lay in synthesis. It collected small, seemingly harmless details and assembled them into strategic understanding. By mid-1943, Soviet analysts already suspected that the Western Allies were planning for contingencies beyond a straightforward German surrender. This suspicion did not come from paranoia. It came from observation. Allied planning staffs began requesting data that did not align with announced operations. Questions about German administrative structures, rail networks far east of expected Allied reach, and civil governance procedures raised quiet red flags. These were not invasion questions, they were occupation questions. Soviet intelligence officers attached to Allied missions noticed changes in classification patterns. Documents related to post-war administration began circulating more narrowly. Liaison briefings grew more guarded. Certain geographic discussions disappeared from shared forums altogether. For NKVD analysts, this was confirmation. Rankin's existence was inferred long before its specifics were suspected. What Stalin wanted to know was not whether the Allies had plans. He assumed they did. What mattered was whether those plans posed a credible constraint on Soviet objectives. By late 1943, Soviet reports to the Kremlin assessed that Western Allied capabilities east of the Rhine were limited. They concluded that any attempt to race the Red Army would face overwhelming logistical and political barriers. This assessment shaped Soviet behavior. The Red Army intensified its tempo not merely to defeat Germany, but to preempt Allied maneuvering. Speed became strategy. Every kilometer gained reduced the relevance of hypothetical Western plans. NKVD field reports from Eastern Europe emphasized urgency. Commanders were encouraged to push forward even when consolidation lagged. Political officers followed close behind, establishing control structures immediately. This was not improvisation. It was anticipation. Stalin did not need to see Rankin to neutralize it. He only needed to understand its constraints. There is no evidence that Stalin ever believed the Western Allies would confront him militarily over occupation zones during the war. Soviet intelligence assessed American leadership as risk-averse and British leadership as constrained. That assessment proved correct. As Rankin stagnated inside SHAEF, Soviet confidence grew. NKVD summaries from late 1944 speak with increasing certainty about post-war boundaries forming along lines of advance. In other words, facts were being created faster than plans. One of the most revealing aspects of Soviet awareness was what they chose not to do. Stalin did not protest Rankin publicly. He did not accuse the Allies of bad faith. He did not issue warnings. Silence was strategy. By not acknowledging Western contingency planning, Stalin avoided forcing decisions. He allowed Allied hesitation to do the work for him. The NKVD also monitored internal Allied debates closely. Disagreements between British and American leadership were not secrets. They were observable through changes in coordination, tone, and tempo. Every delay validated Soviet assumptions. By early 1945, NKVD assessments concluded that Allied occupation ambitions east of agreed lines were non-operational. Rankin, if it still existed, was no longer actionable. This knowledge freed Soviet commanders to advance theories without diplomatic restraint. When Soviet troops crossed into Central Europe, they did so with the confidence that no competing Allied presence would arrive in time to challenge them meaningfully. Stalin's awareness did not come from clairvoyance. It came from intelligence, discipline, and patience. Rankin had assumed uncertainty would create opportunity. Soviet intelligence ensured uncertainty worked in the opposite direction. By the time Allied forces reached the Elbe, the outcome Rankin sought to prevent had already solidified. The Soviet Union did not block Rankin with tanks. It blocked it with information and momentum, and in the end, that proved sufficient. Operation Rankin did not end with cancellation. It ended with irrelevance. By the spring of 1945, the conditions Rankin had been designed to exploit no longer existed. Germany did not collapse suddenly in the West. It disintegrated unevenly under pressure from the East. The Red Army reached the Oder. Then the suburbs of Berlin. Then the city itself. Rankin's window had closed without a sound. There was no order striking the plan from the record, no directive declaring it obsolete. The files simply stopped circulating. The scenario tables stopped updating. The contingency language disappeared from briefings. In bureaucratic terms, Rankin died the most permanent death possible. It was no longer discussed. This silence was deliberate. Acknowledging Rankin after the war would have raised uncomfortable questions. Why had the plan existed at all? Why had it been abandoned? And most dangerously, what did its abandonment imply about Allied intentions and limitations? For the victorious powers, there was no incentive to answer. The Western Allies emerged from the war exhausted but triumphant. Public narratives emphasized unity, sacrifice, and cooperation. Rankin fit none of those themes. It implied mistrust, competition, preemptive maneuvering against an ally still officially celebrated. So Rankin was buried. It did not appear in early post-war memoirs. It was absent from official campaign histories. It did not feature in discussions of Yalta or Potsdam. When archives slowly opened decades later, Rankin surfaced only as a footnote, stripped of its original political meaning. Yet its consequences were everywhere. The division of Germany followed lines of contact, not lines of intent. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, not because it was negotiated away at a single conference, but because no Western force stood there when the fighting ended. Rankin had been an attempt, the last serious attempt, to prevent that outcome without direct confrontation. Its failure confirmed a new reality. Power in post-war Europe would not be balanced by goodwill. It would be stabilized by deterrence. Within a few years, doctrines emerged that echoed Rankin's logic in colder form. Presence mattered. Speed mattered. Vacuums were dangerous. But now those lessons were institutionalized through alliances, bases, and permanent deployments. Rankin had been too early and too constrained to succeed. It also exposed a deeper truth about the Allied victory. The Western Allies won the war they planned for. They lost influence in the war they feared. Operation Rankin existed because planners understood that defeating Nazi Germany was not the final strategic problem. Managing what replaced it was. When the moment came, they chose restraint over risk. That choice shaped the next half-century. Germany was divided. Europe was split. Eastern nations disappeared behind an ideological boundary enforced by force, not consent. Western leaders protested, negotiated, and condemned. But the map did not change. Rankin's quiet death marked the moment when acceptance replaced resistance. It is tempting to see this as inevitability, but Rankin's very existence proves it was not inevitable, only constrained. The plan failed not because it was incoherent, but because it required a unity of purpose that no longer existed inside the alliance. Britain wanted leverage. America wanted stability. The Soviet Union wanted facts on the ground. Only one of those objectives aligned with momentum. In the end, Rankin remains valuable, not as a what-if, but as evidence. Evidence that Allied leaders understood the stakes. Evidence that they foresaw the division of Europe. evidence that they considered acting and chose not to. That decision was never put to a vote. It was never debated in public. It was executed through silence. Operation Rankin died quietly so that a larger story could be told loudly. Victory, unity, peace. But beneath that story lies a buried file, stamped most secret, that tells a harder truth. That the end of the war was not the end of competition, only the moment when one side stopped trying to compete. If you want more declassified plans, buried files, and the decisions that shaped the world after the shooting stopped, subscribe to WW2 Declassified. This channel doesn't retell battles. It exposes the choices history tried to forget. Next episodes will dive deeper into the plans that never reached the battlefield, and the ones that quietly decided the Cold War before it began. Subscribe and step inside the files that were never meant to be opened.